Welcome to Passions Illustrated. Before starting the video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe.
The sharp, insistent ring of the alarm clock at 6:45 a.m. was met only by silence from the empty side of the double bed. Rebecca Henderson opened her eyes slowly, her hand automatically groping for the space where Cameron should be. The pillow still held a slight depression of his head, but the sheets were already cold. Nothing unusual for a Tuesday in Phoenix, Arizona. Cameron always left early for his meetings at the law firm where he was a partner. Except this time, something was different. Rebecca noticed this as she descended the stairs from her home in the elegant Arcadia neighborhood. The Italian leather briefcase that Cameron cherished so much a gift from their third wedding anniversary was still hanging on the rack near the door. He never went out without it. Cameron. His voice echoed through the empty house, bouncing off the walls decorated with photos of their 5 years of marriage. Frozen moments of smiles and hugs that now seemed to belong to an old faded movie. Breakfast was untouched in the planned kitchen, no trace of her husband's morning routine. No dirty cup in the sink, no newspaper lying untidy on the marble counter. Rebecca felt a shiver run down her spine as she checked her cell phone for the 10th time. No messages, no missed calls. The hours dragged on like decades as she called the office, hospitals, and even the police. Cameron's secretary, Madison, sounded genuinely surprised when she informed him that he hadn't shown up for the important client meeting that morning. Actually, Mrs. Henderson. Mr. Henderson has canceled all his appointments for the rest of the week. I received an email from him last night about it. Rebecca sat down heavily on the living room sofa, her legs shaking. Cameron hadn't mentioned anything about canceling appointments. The night before, they'd had dinner together, talked about plans for the weekend, and he'd kissed her forehead before bed as he always did. It was only when he decided to check the closet that his world completely fell apart. Cameron's drawers were empty. His dress shirts carefully organized by color, his Italian suits, his silk ties, everything was gone. In the place where she used to keep her important documents, she found only a white envelope with her name written in her husband's familiar handwriting. Rebecca. By the time you read this, I'll be long gone. Don't try to look for me. I'm sorry. C. The words danced before her eyes as tears blurred her vision. How could someone just disappear like that without explanation after 5 years of apparently happy marriage? It was in this moment of despair that Rebecca found the business card of Dominic Maxwell, a private detective recommended by her best friend Lauren. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number. Dominic's office was in downtown Phoenix in a restored Art Deco building that contrasted with the modern skyscrapers around it. Rebecca observed the man of around 35 who welcomed her into his office. His deep blue eyes conveyed a mixture of professionalism and compassion that made her feel instantly safer. "Mrs. Henderson, please tell me everything from the beginning," Dominic said, his voice calm and reassuring as he indicated a worn leather armchair. Rebecca took a deep breath and began to narrate her story, watching as Dominic took meticulous notes in a black-bound notebook. She noticed the framed photos on the wall solved cases she assumed, and wondered if her own story would one day be part of that collection. "Something tells me there's a lot more to this story than a simple case of a runaway husband," Dominic commented after hearing her account. "In my experience, people don't build elaborate lives just to abandon them for no reason. There's always a trail, always a story behind the story." As the Arizona sun set through the office windows, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what she might discover about the man she thought she knew so well, and hope of finally understanding the truth. "I'm going to need access to all your husband's documents, financial records, call history, anything that might give us clues about his life over the last few years," Dominic explained, leaning forward in his chair. "And I need you to be prepared. Sometimes the truth we find isn't what we expected to discover." Rebecca nodded, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. "I need to know Mr. Maxwell. No matter what it is, I need to understand why the man I loved decided that our life together meant nothing." Leaving the office that night, Rebecca couldn't have imagined that her search for answers would lead her not only to discover Cameron's true identity, but also to question everything she believed she knew about love, trust, and second chances. And she certainly didn't expect that the man hired to unravel the mystery of her missing husband would end up becoming much more than just an investigator in her life. Dominic Maxwell stared at his computer screen, his eyes roaming over Cameron Henderson's financial records for the last 5 years. Something didn't add up. The apparently normal transactions hid a subtle pattern that only a trained eye could spot: small amounts being transferred regularly to an account in the Cayman Islands. "Ms. Parker, please bring the Henderson case file," he called to his assistant over the intercom. Within seconds, Amanda Parker entered his office with a folder full of documents. "I also found something interesting about his birth certificate," she commented, placing the papers on the mahogany desk. The detective frowned as he examined the document. Cameron Henderson's birth certificate had been issued only 6 years ago, a few months before he met Rebecca. A meticulous forgery, but with subtle inconsistencies that now stood out. Rebecca arrived at the office that afternoon wearing a navy blue dress that contrasted with her pale skin. Dominic noticed that she had lost weight since their first meeting a week ago. The dark circles under her green eyes were a sign of a bad night's sleep. "We found some inconsistencies," Dominic began, indicating the chair to Rebecca. "Your husband, well, Cameron Henderson probably isn't his real name." Rebecca felt the air escape from her lungs. "What do you mean?" "His identity was carefully constructed about 6 years ago. We found regular transfers to an offshore account, and most importantly, his birth certificate is fake." Rebecca's hands were shaking as she held up the documents Dominic was showing her. "But we met at a charity event. He had friends, professional contacts. How is that possible?" "Resourceful people can create very convincing personas," Dominic explained, his voice gentle. "We found records of a consulting firm in Denver, Colorado that can give us some answers. I plan to pay them a visit later this week." Rebecca looked up from her papers. "I'll go with you." "Ms. Henderson, I don't think it's—" "Please." She interrupted him, her voice firm despite the restrained tears. "I need to see for myself. I can't just sit and wait while my life falls apart." Dominic studied her face for a moment, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "All right, we'll leave early tomorrow." The flight to Denver was silent. Rebecca watched the clouds from the airplane window, lost in thought about the moments she had shared with Cameron. Each memory now had a bitter taste of doubt. Next to her, Dominic reviewed his notes, occasionally casting worried glances in her direction. The consultancy's office was in an elegant building in Denver's financial center. The receptionist welcomed them with a professional smile, but her eyes widened slightly when Dominic showed her a photo of Cameron. "Oh, you mean Alexander Wright," she said, not realizing the impact of her words. "He worked here for a few months about 7 years ago." Rebecca felt her legs go weak. Dominic discreetly held her elbow, offering support. "Alexander Wright?" he asked, maintaining a casual tone. "Yes, he was one of our best consultants, until he disappeared overnight, leaving several important projects pending." The next few hours were spent digging through old records and talking to employees who still remembered Alexander Wright. Each new piece of information was like a stab in Rebecca's heart. Her husband wasn't just a liar, he was a man who made an art of lying. At the hotel that night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. Sitting on the balcony of her room, she watched the city lights as silent tears streamed down her face. A soft knock on the door surprised her. "I thought you might want a bit of company," Dominic said, holding out 2 cups of tea. "And some answers." Rebecca accepted the cup with a small, grateful smile. How can someone live such an elaborate lie? Usually, people that have a past they're desperate to hide, Dominic replied, taking a seat in the chair next to her. "What we discovered today is just the tip of the iceberg." As they talked, Rebecca began to notice small details in Dominic that had previously gone unnoticed: the way his eyes softened when she spoke, how he unconsciously leaned towards her, the comforting warmth of his presence. Tomorrow, we're going to visit an old colleague of Alexander's, Dominic informed her, finishing his tea. Perhaps he can give us more clues about who your husband really is. Rebecca nodded, realizing that for the first time since Cameron's or Alexander's disappearance, she didn't feel completely lost. Dominic's presence brought a strange sense of security, even when everything else in her life seemed to be falling apart. "Thank you," she whispered as he got up to leave, "for not letting me go through this alone." Dominic stopped in the doorway, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You're not alone in this, Rebecca. I promise." That night, as she tried to sleep, Rebecca realized that her life had turned into a complex puzzle where each piece revealed only made the picture more confusing. But now, at least, she had someone by her side to help her put the pieces together, someone whom surprisingly she was beginning to trust more than she had thought possible. Alexander Wright's former colleague lived in a luxurious condominium on the outskirts of Denver. Marcus Donovan, a man in his 50s with perfectly trimmed gray hair, welcomed them into his private office with a wary expression when he saw the Cameron Alexander photo. "So, he's done it again," Marcus commented, pouring himself a whiskey as he studied the photo. His voice carried a mixture of resignation and something that sounded like pity as he looked at Rebecca. "Again." Dominic leaned forward in his chair, his notebook already open. Rebecca felt her heart racing, her hands clenching the arms of the leather armchair. Marcus sighed deeply. "Alexander Wright isn't his real name either. When I first met him, his name was Michael Thorne. He worked with me in Chicago for almost 2 years before moving to Denver. He was married to a financial market executive called Catherine." Rebecca felt her world spin. Not only had her husband had another identity before he met her, he had another wife. "What happened to Catherine?" Dominic asked, his hand unconsciously resting on Rebecca's in a gesture of support. "She disappeared with almost $5 million from her accounts," Marcus replied, turning over the rest of his drink. "Catherine was devastated. We found out later that he had done the same thing in Seattle under the name Daniel Porter." Tears began to stream down Rebecca's face as the truth unfolded like a horror movie. Her husband was a professional con man, a man who made manipulation and abandonment a fine art. "There's more," Marcus continued, walking over to his computer. "After Catherine hired investigators, we discovered his real name, Benjamin Crawford, son of a realtor from Portland, Oregon. He changed his identity for the first time when he was 22 after a real estate fraud scheme that was almost discovered." Dominic photographed documents and made frantic notes while Marcus shared every detail he knew. Rebecca watched in silence, feeling as if she was watching the destruction of her life in slow motion. On the way back to the hotel inside the rental car, Rebecca finally broke the silence. "How could I have been so blind 5 years, Dominic? 5 years living with a complete stranger." Dominic stopped at a viewpoint overlooking the Rocky Mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of purple and gold that seemed to mock the darkness Rebecca felt in her heart. "People like him are experts in manipulation," Dominic said softly, turning to face her. "They study their victims, they know exactly what to say and how to act to gain trust. It's not your fault. But you should have realized something," she insisted, her voice breaking. "The mysterious phone calls, the business trips that went on without explanation." "Rebecca," Dominic interrupted her gently, his blue eyes meeting hers with intensity. "You loved him. Love makes us see what we want to see, believe the best in people." Something in the way he looked at her made her heart skip a beat. For the first time since Cameron had disappeared, Rebecca felt a spark of something other than pain, a connection that frightened and intrigued her at the same time. Back in Phoenix the next day, Dominic and Rebecca delved deeper into the investigation. Each new discovery revealed more layers of the elaborate Benjamin Shiu Cameron scheme. Hidden bank accounts, properties in the names of shell companies, a web of lies so intricate that it seemed impossible to untangle. During the long hours in Dominic's office, Rebecca began to notice subtle changes in herself. The pain was still there, but along with it grew a fierce determination to not only find answers but to rebuild her life from the ashes Cameron had left behind. "I've found something," Dominic announced one evening while they were working, late. "A pattern in financial transactions. He always moves the money following the same system, just changing the locations." Rebecca moved closer to look at the computer screen, her shoulder brushing Dominic's. The contact, although brief, sent a shiver down her spine that she tried to ignore. "If we follow this pattern," Dominic continued, his voice slightly husky, "we can predict his next move. He's probably setting up somewhere on the East Coast." "So we can find him?" Rebecca asked, a confused mix of emotions in her voice. Dominic turned to her so close that she could smell his soft perfume. "We can. But the question is, what do you want to do when we find him?" It was a question Rebecca had been avoiding asking herself. Did she want justice, revenge, or just answers so she could finally move on? "I need to look him in the eye one last time," she replied after a moment's thought. "I need him to see what he's done, what he's destroyed. And then I want to put it all behind. Me." Dominic nodded in understanding. His gaze lingered on her face for a moment longer than necessary, and Rebecca felt her heart racing again, this time for a completely different reason. As she drove home that evening, Rebecca realized that, for the first time since Cameron's disappearance, it wasn't his betrayal that occupied her thoughts, but the gentle smile of a certain private detective and the way he made her feel safe in a world that had lost all meaning. The morning began with a disturbing discovery. Rebecca woke up to a call from Dominic. He had found records of a bank account in Boston, linked to a name that appeared on old Benjamin Cameron documents, Jason Miller. "There's been some recent movement," Dominic explained, his voice tense on the other end of the line. "A significant transfer 3 days ago. Rebecca, I think he's there." 2 hours later, Rebecca found Dominic in his office. Maps and documents covered the desk, forming a mosaic of her ex-husband's fraudulent life. Amanda, Dominic's assistant, entered more information about the Boston account. "The transfer was to a real estate developer," Amanda explained. "They're building a luxury condominium in Cambridge, and guess what? Jason Miller is listed as one of the main investors." Rebecca felt her stomach turn. The idea that Benjamin was already building his next life, probably preparing to meet his next victim, made her queasy. "We need to go to Boston," Dominic declared, his eyes meeting Rebecca's. "If we act fast, we can catch him before he disappears again." The flight to Boston was scheduled for the following morning. Rebecca spent the night going through old photographs, looking for signs that might have given away Cameron's true nature. In each image, his smile seemed different now, calculated, rehearsed. On the plane, sitting next to Dominic, Rebecca couldn't stop thinking about how drastically her life had changed in just a few weeks. "Sometimes I wonder if any of it was real," she confessed quietly. Dominic closed the file he was reading and turned to her. "The feelings were real, Rebecca. Yours were. Don't let his actions diminish that." There was something about the way he looked at her that made her heart beat faster. It was a look of understanding, of genuine concern, something she was beginning to realize she had never really seen in Cameron's eyes. In Boston, they stayed in a hotel near the Charles River. The city boasted an autumnal beauty with golden leaves dancing in the historic streets of Cambridge. In other circumstances, Rebecca would have found the setting romantic. The developer was in a modern building in the financial center. Dominic had arranged a meeting posing as an investor interested in the development. Rebecca waited in the car, her heart pounding as she watched him enter the building. An hour later, Dominic returned with a triumphant smile. "He has a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. All the main investors will be there." "How are we going to do that?" Rebecca asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You're going in with me as my partner," Dominic explained. "He won't expect to see us there. The element of surprise is our advantage." That evening, as they went over the plan in a small cafe on Beacon Hill, Rebecca noticed how different Dominic looked outside the formal setting of his office. His blazer was slung over his chair, the sleeves of his shirt folded up to reveal strong forearms. there was something unpretentiously attractive about his manner. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked, his blue eyes searching hers over his coffee cup. "Honestly, I'm terrified," Rebecca admitted, "but also anxious to get it over with once and for all." Dominic reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. "I'll be by your side the whole time." The touch, though brief, sent a wave of warmth through her body. Rebecca realized that she was beginning to see Dominic in a different light, not just as the detective who helped her, but as someone who genuinely cared about her. Back at the hotel, as she was getting ready for bed, Rebecca was surprised by a soft knock on her door. It was Dominic holding a briefcase. "Sorry about the time," he said, "but I thought you should see this before tomorrow." The folder contained more documents about Benjamin Crawford's past, including photos of him with Catherine, his ex-wife in Chicago. Seeing her husband in intimate moments with another woman should have been painful, but Rebecca felt only a strange detachment, as if she were looking into a stranger's life. "He looks exactly the same," she murmured, studying the photos. "The same smile, the same gestures." "That's because he's a professional," Dominic replied, taking a seat next to her in the small living room. "But tomorrow, we'll see his real face." Rebecca looked up from the photos, meeting Dominic's intense gaze. The closeness between them seemed charged with electricity. For a moment, she thought he was going to lean down and kiss her, and surprisingly, she realized that she wanted him to. But Dominic stood up, maintaining his professional posture. "Have a good rest. Tomorrow will be an intense day." After he left, Rebecca lay awake for hours, her thoughts divided between the confrontation that awaited her and the growing attraction she felt for Dominic. How was it possible that in the midst of so much chaos and disappointment, her heart could find room for new feelings? The clock struck 3:27 a.m. when she finally fell asleep, lulled by the certainty that whatever happened at the meeting, her life would never be the same again, and perhaps that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The lobby of the corporate building in Boston pulsed with the typical energy of a business morning. Rebecca adjusted the black blazer she had bought especially for the occasion, while Dominic confirmed the details of the meeting with the receptionist. Her heart was pounding so hard that she feared everyone around her could hear it. "Mr. Maxwell." The receptionist smiled professionally. "Mr. Miller will see you in the conference room on the 15th floor." In the elevator, Dominic gently held Rebecca's hand, which was shaking slightly. "Remember, you're stronger than him. You always have been." The doors opened onto an elegant corridor decorated with modern art. Rebecca could hear voices coming from the conference room, and then distinctly that familiar laugh that now sounded like a knife in her ears. Dominic entered, first playing his role of interested investor perfectly. Rebecca followed, keeping partially hidden behind other executives entering the room. And then she saw him. Cameron, no Benjamin, was standing by the window, gesturing animatedly as he talked to two investors. His impeccable navy blue suit and charismatic smile were exactly as she remembered. For a surreal moment, it seemed as if the last few months hadn't happened. "Gentlemen, may we begin?" Benjamin announced, turning to the table. His eyes traveled around the room, stopping abruptly when they found Rebecca. The smile froze on her face, a mask of shock replacing her confident expression. "Hello, Cameron," Rebecca said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Or should I say Benjamin, or do you prefer Alexander Michael Daniel?" Chaos ensued in the room. Benjamin tried to keep his composure, but his eyes betrayed his panic. "Gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we need to reschedule this meeting." "Not so fast," Dominic intervened, blocking the door. "We have a lot to discuss, Mr. Crawford." The other executives, confused, started to get up. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded. "What's going on?" Rebecca replied, her voice growing in strength. "Is that this man is a professional swindler who has already stolen millions of dollars from several people, including his ex-wives." Benjamin tried to laugh, but the sound came out strangled. "Rebecca, darling, you're clearly confused." "Confused?" She laughed bitterly, throwing the documents proving their multiple identities on the table. "Like Catherine in Chicago, or the other women you abandoned after stealing their savings." The executives in the room began to murmur, some already reaching for their phones. Benjamin looked around frantically like a cornered animal. "You don't understand." He tried to explain, his mask of charm crumbling. "I had to do it. You don't know what it's like." "Like what?" Rebecca interrupted him, years of pent-up anger finally spilling over. "What it's like to lie, manipulating, destroying lives." Dominic moved closer to her, his presence silently protective. Benjamin noticed the movement, his eyes narrowing as he observed the closeness between them. "I've already called the police," one of the executives announced. "They're on their way." Benjamin suddenly advanced towards the door, but Dominic was quicker, blocking his passage. In the ensuing confusion, Rebecca watched the man she had once loved turn into a desperate stranger before her eyes. "Why, Benjamin?" she asked, her voice now softer, almost pitying. "Why do this to me, with all of them?" He stopped, struggling against Dominic, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Because I could," he replied simply. "Because it was easy. Because people like you, Rebecca, people who believe in love, are so easy to fool." The words hit Rebecca like a slap, but instead of pain, she felt only relief. She finally saw Benjamin Crawford for what he really was, an empty man incapable of understanding the true meaning of love. The police arrived minutes later. As Emuin. She watched Benjamin being handcuffed and led away. Rebecca felt the soft touch of Dominic's hand on her back. "You were amazing," he whispered. In the cafe next to the building an hour later, Rebecca finally allowed the tears to fall, not of sadness but of relief and release. "How are you feeling?" Dominic asked, offering her a handkerchief. "Like I've woken up from a very long nightmare," she replied, meeting his eyes. "And like I'm ready to start again." The way Dominic looked at her made her heart race for completely different reasons than the ones she had felt earlier. There was something new brewing between them, something that frightened and thrilled her at the same time. "Rebecca," he began hesitantly, "now that the case is closed." "It's not," she interrupted him gently. "We still have to help the other women he deceived. Catherine, the others. They deserve to know the truth. They deserve justice too." Dominic smiled a smile full of admiration and something else that made Rebecca's heart skip a beat. "Then let's help them together." On the busy Boston street, with the autumn sun shining down on them, Rebecca realized that sometimes you have to lose everything to find something true. And as she watched Dominic talking to his contacts on the phone, organizing the next steps in the investigation, she felt a growing certainty that her heart, although bruised, was still capable of recognizing true love when she found it. The weeks following the confrontation in Boston were intense. Rebecca and Dominic immersed themselves in the painstaking work of tracking down and contacting all the women Benjamin Crawford had cheated on over the years. Catherine, Chicago's ex-wife, was the first to respond. "I never thought anyone would be able to catch him," Catherine said during a video conference from Dominic's office. Her dark eyes still bore traces of hurt, but also a glint of satisfaction that Benjamin was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Rebecca watched the screen, sitting next to Dominic. The closeness between them had become something natural, comfortable, even if it was fraught with an unresolved tension that neither of them dared to address directly. "We've managed to locate 3 more victims," Amanda reported, entering the room with a new pile of documents. "One in Seattle, one in Portland, and surprisingly one in Anchorage, Alaska." "He really did go all over the country," Rebecca muttered, leafing through the files. Each new discovery about Benjamin's criminal life no longer hurt her like before. Instead, it strengthened her resolve to make sure he couldn't claim any more victims. Dominic lightly touched her arm. "Do you want to take a break? We can have lunch." The small Italian restaurant 2 blocks from the office had become his refuge over the last few days. Between mouthfuls of pasta alla vodka, Rebecca found herself studying Dominic's face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was pensive. "I got an interesting call today," he commented, wiping his lips with his napkin. "The FBI is interested in the case. Apparently, Benjamin may be connected to a larger network of financial frauds. Rebecca put down her fork. Does that mean we'll have to go to Washington? Yes, they want to meet us in person next week. Dominic hesitated for a moment. Actually, they want to talk to you specifically. Your perspective as an ex-wife could be crucial to the case. Rebecca's heart raced not at the mention of Benjamin, but at the prospect of another trip with Dominic. Their last few weeks working together had created a dynamic that went far beyond the client-investigator relationship. Back in the office, Rebecca found an envelope on her desk, more documents about Benjamin's past. But for the first time, she felt no urgency to open it. Instead, her eyes were drawn to Dominic, who was chatting animatedly on the phone, gesturing as he walked across the room. "Agent Marshall will meet us on Tuesday," he announced after hanging up. "I've booked tickets for Monday afternoon. I thought we could use Tuesday morning to go over the files before the meeting." Rebecca nodded, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her chest at the thought of more time alone with him. Sounds perfect. That evening, while organizing her suitcase for Washington, Rebecca was surprised by a knock on her door. It was Lauren, her best friend, carrying a bottle of wine and a knowing smile. "So," Lauren began, filling 2 glasses, "when are you going to admit that you're in love with your detective?" Rebecca almost choked on her wine. "Lauren, oh please, I see how you look at him. And, more importantly, I see how he looks at you." Rebecca sank onto the sofa, her cheeks burning. "It's complicated." "No, it's not," Lauren interrupted her gently. "What was complicated was your marriage to Benjamin. That," she gestured vaguely, "that's simple. It's real." Lauren's words echoed in Rebecca's mind throughout the flight to Washington. Sitting next to Dominic, she couldn't help but notice how he unconsciously leaned towards her when he spoke, how his fingers occasionally brushed hers as he pointed to something in the documents they were reviewing. The hotel in Georgetown was a restored historic building overlooking the C&O Canal. After they checked in, Dominic suggested a stroll to get to know the area. "There's a lovely cafe a few blocks from here," he commented as they walked along the cobbled streets. The October air was cool, and Rebecca instinctively moved closer to him in search of warmth. In the cafe, as they sipped cappuccinos and watched the sun set over the Potomac, the silence between them seemed laden with unspoken words. "Rebecca." Dominic finally broke the silence, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made his heart stop. "After all this is over." "Yes," she whispered, barely daring to breathe. "I don't want it to end," he admitted softly. "Our partnership, our time together, it means so much more to me than just a professional affair." Rebecca felt tears forming in her eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness. "To me, too," she replied, her hand finding his on the table. The touch of their intertwined fingers seemed to carry a promise of a new beginning, of unexplored possibilities, of a love born not of manipulation or deceit, but of a true and deep connection. When their gazes met again, Rebecca knew that Lauren was right. This was simple. It was real. It was the start of something that, unlike her past with Benjamin, had the potential to be truly extraordinary. The meeting with the FBI the next day turned out to be more significant than Rebecca and Dominic had imagined. Agent Marshall, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes, presented evidence linking Benjamin Crawford to an elaborate fraud ring that stretched across the country. "Your testimony will be crucial, Ms. Henderson," Marshall explained, spreading photographs out on the conference table. "Benjamin Crawford isn't just a lone con artist, he's part of an organization that specifically targets successful women." Rebecca examined the photos, recognizing familiar patterns in the stories of other victims. Each case followed a similar script: a seemingly casual encounter, an intense and quick relationship, marriage, and then disappearance with significant amounts of money. "There have been at least 12 confirmed cases in the last 10 years, Marshall continued, "and we suspect there are many more." Dominic, sitting next to Rebecca, was taking detailed notes, occasionally casting worried glances in her direction. His hand found hers under the table, offering silent support. After the meeting, walking through the gardens of the National Mall, Rebecca processed the day's revelations. The autumn sun painted the leaves of the trees in shades of amber and red, creating a surreally beautiful setting for such a serious conversation. "How are you?" Dominic asked, stopping near the water mirror. "Strangely, I feel stronger," Rebecca replied, turning to face him. "Knowing that I can help other women avoid what I've been through gives it all a purpose." Dominic smiled, that smile that made her heart race. "You're extraordinary, you know that. Dom." She began using for the first time the nickname she had been meaning to utter for weeks. Before she could continue, Dominic's phone rang. It was Amanda, with urgent news from Phoenix. "We've found 2 more victims," she informed him, "and one of them is willing to testify." The next few days were a whirlwind of depositions, meetings with federal prosecutors, and long conversations with other women Benjamin had tricked. Rebecca and Dominic worked side by side, their connection growing stronger with each shared moment. One evening, while reviewing documents in their hotel room, Rebecca noticed something different about Dominic's behavior. He seemed distracted, even nervous. "Is something wrong?" she asked, putting down the papers she was reading. Dominic stood up from his chair, running his hand through his hair, a gesture she already knew so well. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something." Her heart raced. "What is it?" "During those weeks investigating the case, helping other victims, something changed. Or maybe it was always there from the first day in my office." Rebecca held her breath, feeling that the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. "I know it's unprofessional," he continued, stepping closer. "I know I should keep my distance, especially considering everything you've been through. But I can no longer pretend that what I feel for you is just professional concern." "Dom?" She tried to interrupt, but he continued. "You're the strongest, most incredible person I've ever met. Seeing how you've coped with all this, how you care about helping other people even after everything you've been through. Rebecca, I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air for a moment, full of hope and possibility. Rebecca felt tears forming in her eyes, but this time they were of pure happiness. "I fell in love with you too," she confessed softly. "And for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of that feeling." Dominic crossed the space between them in 2 steps, taking her face in his hands with a delicacy that made her heart melt. When their lips finally met, it was as if all the pieces of a complex puzzle finally fell into place. In the weeks that followed as the case against Benjamin Crawford and his criminal organization developed, Rebecca and Dominic built something new and precious. Their relationship, born in the midst of pain and chaos, blossomed into something deeply true. A month after their first kiss walking, along La Jolla Beach during a trip to interview yet another witness in California, Rebecca realized that she had found not only love, but also her purpose. Together with Dominic, she started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of romance scams, turning their painful experience into something positive. "You know what's ironic?" she commented as they watched the sun set over the Pacific. "Benjamin thought he was destroying me, but he actually freed me. He freed me to find something real." Dominic pulled her closer, kissing her forehead softly. "Sometimes we need to go through the false to recognize the true." And there, with the waves gently breaking on the beach and the sky painted in shades of pink and gold, Rebecca knew she had found not just a new love, but a new version of herself, stronger, wiser, and ready for all the adventures life still had in store for them.